Eleanor Morrison adjusted the heavy headphones over her auburn hair and squinted at the radio equipment surrounding her workstation. The basement communications center of Naval Station Norfolk buzzed with activity, though most of her male colleagues seemed more interested in discussing weekend plans than monitoring the vital transmissions flowing in from ships scattered across the Atlantic. At 22, Ellie was one of only 3 women assigned to the communications division, and she could feel the weight of skeptical glances every time she walked into the room. The morning shift had started like any other in July 1943. Commander Phillips conducted his usual briefing with barely a nod in her direction, addressing his instructions primarily to the men who formed the majority of his staff. Ellie had grown accustomed to this treatment over the past 6 months since her assignment to Norfolk. Her typing skills and college education in mathematics had earned her the position, but earning respect was proving to be an entirely different challenge. She settled into her chair and began monitoring Channel 7, the frequency assigned to destroyer escorts operating in the North Atlantic convoy routes. The static was particularly heavy that morning, interference from a storm system moving across the ocean making communication difficult. Ellie fine-tuned the equipment with practiced precision, her trained ear picking out fragments of Morse code through the atmospheric noise that others might miss entirely. Around 10:30, she caught something unusual. A faint signal, barely detectable above the static, transmitted in short bursts. The pattern was irregular, not following standard naval communication protocols. She adjusted the receiver's sensitivity and listened more carefully. There was again 3 short pulses, 3 long ones, then 3 short ones again. SOS. But it was weak, fragmented, and seemed to be coming from an unexpected direction. Ellie glanced around the communications center. Sergeant Martinez was reading a newspaper while monitoring his assigned frequency. Petty Officer Johnson was engaged in animated conversation with 2 other operators about baseball scores. None of them seemed to have noticed the distress signal she was receiving. She double-checked her equipment settings and confirmed she was monitoring the correct frequency. The signal was definitely there, but it was so faint that anyone not paying complete attention would miss it entirely. She raised her hand to get Commander Phillips' attention. He was studying shipping charts at his desk across the room, a cup of coffee steaming beside a stack of reports. After several attempts to catch his eye, she finally stood up and walked over to him. "Commander, I'm picking up what sounds like a distress signal on Channel 7, she reported, keeping her voice professional despite the urgency she felt building inside her chest. Phillips looked up from his charts with mild irritation. "Morrison, Channel 7 is for convoy communications. If there was a real emergency, multiple stations would be receiving it. Are you sure you're not picking up interference from the storm front?" Ellie felt her cheeks warm, but maintained her composure. "Sir, I've been monitoring atmospheric interference all morning. This is different. It's definitely Morse code, SOS pattern, but very weak. The transmission appears to be coming from grid reference." "Morrison," Phillips interrupted, his tone suggesting he was losing patience. "I appreciate your dedication, but we have experienced operators monitoring emergency frequencies. If there was a genuine distress call, they would have reported it by now. Please return to your station and continue standard monitoring procedures." She wanted to argue, to insist that he listen to the signal himself, but she knew that pushing further would only reinforce his perception of her as an inexperienced woman overreacting to routine radio noise. Instead, she nodded curtly and returned to her workstation, the frustration burning in her stomach like acid. But Ellie didn't give up. She continued monitoring the faint signal, carefully noting the time intervals between transmissions and plotting the probable source location on her grid map. Over the next 2 hours, the pattern became clearer. The transmissions were coming in 15-minute intervals, each lasting approximately 30 seconds. The signal strength was gradually weakening, suggesting either equipment failure or a vessel taking on water. During her lunch break, instead of joining the other women in the cafeteria, Ellie remained at her post with a sandwich from the vending machine. She had learned to trust her instincts, and every instinct told her this was a real emergency. At 1:45 p.m., her persistence was rewarded. A slightly stronger transmission came through, and this time she could make out more than just the SOS pattern. There was a call sign, Delta 7 Charlie. She immediately cross-referenced the call sign in the Naval Registry. Delta 7 Charlie was assigned to the USS Hartley, a destroyer escort that had been reported as proceeding as ordered 12 hours earlier. According to the last official communication, the Hartley was supposed to be approximately 200 miles northeast of their current position, escorting a merchant convoy to England. Ellie's pulse quickened. If the Hartley was transmitting from the coordinates she had calculated based on signal direction and strength, the ship was significantly off course and potentially in serious trouble. She pulled out the convoy routing charts and studied them carefully. The position she had triangulated was directly in the path of a known German U-boat patrol area. She looked around the communications center again. Commander Phillips was in a meeting with visiting officers from fleet headquarters. Most of the other operators were focused on routine traffic, their attention divided between their equipment and casual conversation. The afternoon shift change was still an hour away, and she knew that if she waited much longer, any chance of helping the Hartley might be lost. Making a decision that could potentially end her military career, Ellie began working outside her assigned protocols. She switched to an emergency frequency and began attempting to establish direct contact with the USS Hartley. Using her personal call sign, Whiskey Echo 7, she transmitted a careful inquiry, keeping her message brief and avoiding anything that might reveal sensitive information if enemy forces were monitoring the frequency. Delta 7 Charlie, this is Whiskey Echo 7 at Norfolk Station. Received your transmission. Please confirm your status and position. Over. For several minutes, there was no response except static. Ellie waited, her hands slightly trembling as she held the microphone. Then, faintly, came a reply that made her heart race. Whiskey Echo 7, Delta 7 Charlie. Engine failure, taking on water. Position approximately 40 miles south-southeast of last reported coordinates. Convoy scattered due to U-boat attack. Requesting immediate assistance. Over. Ellie quickly wrote down every word, her training taking over despite the adrenaline flooding her system. The Hartley was indeed in serious trouble, exactly as she had suspected. But now she faced an even bigger problem. How to get the information to someone who would take action without revealing that she had been operating outside her assigned duties. She glanced at the clock on the wall. 2:15 p.m. Commander Phillips was still in his meeting, and the afternoon shift supervisor wouldn't arrive for another 45 minutes. Every minute of delay could mean the difference between life and death for the Hartley's crew. She made another decision that would prove to be the turning point of her entire military career. Ellie reached for the red telephone that connected directly to Fleet Operations Command. It was a line reserved for genuine emergencies, and unauthorized use could result in court-martial. But as she listened to another weak transmission from the Hartley reporting that they were abandoning non-essential sections of the ship, she knew she had no choice. The phone rang twice before a crisp voice answered. Fleet Operations, Captain Morrison speaking. For a moment, Ellie was stunned by the coincidence of the name. Then, she realized this was no time for distraction. Captain, this is Communications Specialist Morrison at Norfolk Station. I have a destroyer escort in distress. USS Hartley, call sign Delta 7 Charlie. They report engine failure, taking on water, and request immediate assistance. There was a brief pause before the captain responded. Morrison, is this being reported through proper channels? Where is your shift commander? Ellie took a deep breath, knowing her next words would determine not only her future, but possibly the fate of the Hartley's crew. Sir, I discovered the distress signal during routine monitoring. The transmission is very weak and may have been missed by other stations. I have confirmed the vessel's identity and approximate position. They report a U-boat attack on their convoy and are requesting immediate assistance. Give me their coordinates, the captain ordered, his tone becoming sharper and more focused. Ellie read off the position she had calculated, along with all the details she had gathered from her communications with the Hartley. She could hear Captain Morrison relaying information to others in the background, the urgency in his voice confirming that he was taking her report seriously. "Morrison, you said your name was Morrison as well." "Yes, sir, Eleanor Morrison." "Well, Eleanor Morrison, if your information is accurate, you may have just saved a lot of lives. We're dispatching rescue vessels immediately. Maintain communication with the Hartley if possible, and report any changes in their status directly to this number." After hanging up the phone, Ellie returned to her radio equipment with a mixture of relief and apprehension. She had done what she believed was right, but she had also bypassed her immediate chain of command and made decisions far above her pay grade. When Commander Phillips discovered what she had done, there would certainly be consequences. Over the next 3 hours, Ellie maintained contact with the USS Hartley, providing crucial communication relay between the disabled ship and the rescue vessels speeding to their location. She coordinated position updates, relayed medical information about injured crew members, and provided weather reports that helped the rescue ships navigate through the deteriorating storm conditions. As the afternoon wore on, other operators in the communications center began to notice the intense activity at her station. Sergeant Martinez approached her workstation around 5 o'clock, curiosity evident on his face. "Morrison, what's all the traffic you're handling? Sounds like a major operation." Before she could respond, Commander Phillips emerged from his meeting and noticed the crowd gathering around her station. His expression shifted from confusion to concern as he heard the naval communications flowing through her equipment. "Morrison, report to my office immediately," he ordered, his voice carrying across the entire communications center. Ellie saved her communication log, locked her equipment, and followed Commander Phillips to his small office adjacent to the main operations area. She could feel the eyes of her colleagues watching her departure, and she wondered if this would be the last time she walked through the communications center as a member of the team. Phillips closed the door behind them and gestured for her to sit in the chair across from his desk. His expression was unreadable as he settled into his own chair and opened a folder containing what appeared to be communication logs and reports. "Specialist Morrison, I have just received a very interesting phone call from Fleet Operations. It seems you have been conducting unauthorized communications and bypassing established protocols. Would you care to explain exactly what you have been doing for the past several hours?" Ellie straightened in her chair and met his gaze directly. Whatever consequences she faced, she would not apologize for potentially saving lives. She began recounting the entire sequence of events, from her initial detection of the faint SOS signal to her decision to contact Fleet Operations directly. She explained her reasoning for each action and provided detailed documentation of all her communications with the USS Hartley. As she spoke, Philip's expression gradually shifted from stern disapproval to something resembling surprise, and perhaps even a grudging respect. When she finished her account, he leaned back in his chair and studied her for several long moments. "Morrison, what you did today was either the action of an exceptional communications specialist or the reckless behavior of someone who doesn't understand military protocol. The fact that you were correct about the emergency doesn't automatically justify your methods." Ellie waited for him to continue, her heart pounding as she prepared for whatever disciplinary action he might impose. However, Phillips continued, reaching for another folder on his desk. "I have also received this commendation request from Captain Morrison at Fleet Operations. He specifically requested that your actions today be recognized for exceptional initiative and life-saving communication work. It appears the USS Hartley was successfully rescued with all hands safe, largely due to the early warning and communication coordination you provided." The relief that flooded through Ellie was so intense, she felt momentarily dizzy. Not only was she not facing disciplinary action, but her work was being recognized at the fleet level. It was more validation than she had received in her entire 6 months at Norfolk Station. "There will be changes to your assignment, Morrison," Phillips added, and for a moment her anxiety returned. "Effective immediately, You're being transferred to the Emergency Communications Division. Your new supervisor will be Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chun, and your primary responsibility will be monitoring priority frequencies for exactly the kind of situation you handled today. As Ellie walked back through the main communications center, she noticed that the atmosphere had changed. Her colleagues were no longer looking at her with skepticism or dismissal. Word had already spread about the successful rescue operation and her role in coordinating it. Sergeant Martinez offered her a genuine smile and a respectful nod as she passed the station. That evening, as she packed her personal belongings from her old workstation, Ellie reflected on the day's events. She had learned that sometimes doing the right thing required taking risks that others might not understand or approve of. More importantly, she had proven to herself that her skills and instincts were valuable, regardless of what others might think about her gender or experience level. But this was only the beginning of Eleanor Morrison's journey. The rescue of the USS Hartley would prove to be the first of many critical situations where her exceptional communication skills and unwavering determination would make the difference between success and disaster. What she didn't know was that her call sign, Whiskey Echo 7, was already being discussed in the highest levels of Naval Command, and that her reputation was beginning to spread far beyond the Basement Communications Center at Norfolk Station. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chun had built her reputation on precision and reliability. Unlike many of her male counterparts, she had earned her position through exceptional technical knowledge and an unwavering commitment to excellence. When she requested Eleanor Morrison for her Emergency Communications Division, it raised eyebrows throughout Norfolk Station's command structure. Chun rarely took on personnel without extensive experience, and Morrison was still considered a newcomer by most standards. Their first meeting took place in Chin's office on the morning following the Hartley rescue. Ellie knocked on the door at precisely 0800 hours, her uniform pressed and her notepad ready. Chin looked up from a stack of communication protocols and studied the young woman standing at attention before her desk. At ease, Morrison, have a seat. Chin's voice carried authority without harshness. I've read the reports from yesterday's operation. Captain Morrison at Fleet Operations was quite impressed with your work. But I'm more interested in your thought process. Walk me through how you identified that the signal was genuine and not atmospheric interference. Ellie settled into the chair and chose her words carefully. Ma'am, I've been studying radio wave propagation patterns since college. The interference from the storm front had a specific characteristic, a kind of rolling static that builds and fades in predictable intervals. The SOS signal had a different quality, more focused and deliberate. It was also coming from a fixed point rather than moving with the weather pattern. Chin nodded approvingly. And why did you continue monitoring when your shift commander dismissed your concerns? This was the question Ellie had been dreading. Admitting that she had gone against orders could still result in disciplinary action, regardless of the positive outcome. But Chin's expression suggested she was genuinely interested in understanding Ellie's reasoning rather than looking for grounds for punishment. Ma'am, I trust my training and my equipment. When my instruments tell me something is happening, I've learned to listen. I also knew that if I was wrong, the only consequence would be some wasted time. But if I was right and did nothing, Ellie paused, choosing her next words carefully. The potential cost was too high to ignore. Chun leaned back in her chair, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Morrison, in this division, initiative is not just encouraged, it's required. We handle communications for operations that often can't wait for committee decisions or chain of command approval. You'll be working directly with fleet operations, submarine commands, and special mission units. The work is classified, demanding, and sometimes dangerous. Over the next few weeks, Ellie discovered that her new assignment was unlike anything she had experienced in the Navy. Instead of monitoring routine convoy traffic, she was responsible for maintaining communication links with submarines operating behind enemy lines, coordinating with Allied intelligence networks, and providing communication support for special operations that she was only told about on a need-to-know basis. Her workstation was equipped with the most advanced radio equipment available, including experimental frequency hopping systems and encryption devices that required top-secret clearance to operate. Chun assigned her to the night shift, explaining that the most critical operations typically occurred under cover of darkness. The first major test of her new role came in early August 1943. Ellie was monitoring submarine communications in the Mediterranean when she received an unusual transmission from HMS Triumph, a British submarine operating near the coast of occupied France. The message was brief and coded, but the urgency was unmistakable. They had encountered unexpected enemy resistance during a reconnaissance mission and were requesting emergency extraction for Allied agents they had transported to the French coast. Ellie immediately contacted the British liaison office at Norfolk Station, but the duty officer informed her that all senior personnel were in an emergency meeting regarding Atlantic convoy schedules. The next available contact wouldn't be until 0600 hours, nearly 4 hours away. Meanwhile, HMS Triumph was reporting increasing German patrol activity in their area and growing concern about remaining in their current position much longer. Following the protocols Chun had taught her, Ellie took initiative. She contacted the duty officer at the Joint Allied Operations Center and provided a detailed briefing on the Triumph situation. Within 30 minutes, she was coordinating a complex communication relay between the British submarine, a Royal Navy destroyer operating in the Western Mediterranean, and a Free French resistance cell operating near Marseilles. The operation required precise timing and flawless communication coordination. Ellie had to manage multiple frequencies simultaneously, relay coded messages between parties who couldn't communicate directly, and maintain strict radio silence protocols to avoid detection by German monitoring stations. For 6 hours, she served as the central communication hub for an operation involving dozens of personnel across 3 countries. As dawn broke over the Mediterranean, HMS Triumph reported successful extraction of all Allied agents and safe departure from French coastal waters. The operation had been completed without casualties and without alerting German forces to the submarine's presence. When Lieutenant Commander Chun arrived for the morning shift, she found detailed communication logs documenting every aspect of the night's activities. "Morrison, this is exceptional work," Chun said after reviewing the logs. "You coordinated a multinational special operation without direct supervision and maintained perfect communication security throughout. I'm forwarding this to Admiral Richardson with a recommendation for immediate promotion." But Ellie was learning that success in her new role often came with unexpected challenges. Her reputation for handling critical communications was spreading beyond Norfolk Station, and she began receiving requests for specific assignment from commanders she had never met. Some of these requests came with implicit pressure to bend protocols or take shortcuts that made her uncomfortable. In September 1943, she received a direct communication from a Colonel Bradley at Army Intelligence requesting her assistance with a routine communication check for an upcoming operation in the Pacific Theater. The request seemed straightforward enough, but when she began working with Bradley's team, she realized the operation was far from routine. The Army Intelligence Unit was planning an unauthorized reconnaissance mission in Japanese-occupied territory, and they needed communication support that could not be traced back to official channels. They wanted Ellie to establish contact with resistance fighters in the Philippines using frequencies and protocols that existed outside normal military communication networks. The ethical dilemma kept Ellie awake for several nights. The mission could provide valuable intelligence that might save American lives in future Pacific operations. But participating would require her to violate communication security protocols and potentially compromise other ongoing operations in the region. She decided to discuss the situation with Lieutenant Commander Chun, despite knowing that revealing the unauthorized request might create problems for Colonel Bradley and his team. Chun listened carefully to Ellie's description of the proposed mission and asked several pointed questions about the specific protocols Bradley wanted her to use. "Morrison, you were right to bring this to me," Chun said finally. "What Bradley is proposing would compromise our communication security in the entire Pacific region. More importantly, it would put you in a position where you could be held responsible for any negative consequences of an unauthorized operation. Chun arranged a meeting with Captain Morrison at Fleet Operations to discuss the situation. The meeting took place in a secure conference room with representatives from Army Intelligence, Naval Communications, and Joint Operations Planning. Ellie found herself in the uncomfortable position of explaining why she could not support an operation that several senior officers considered important for national security. With respect, Colonel Bradley, she said during the meeting, the communication protocols you're requesting would create vulnerabilities that Japanese intelligence could exploit. If they detected the unauthorized frequencies, they could use that information to locate and compromise legitimate resistance networks throughout the Pacific. Colonel Bradley's response was sharp and dismissive. Specialist Morrison, I appreciate your technical concerns, but strategic decisions should be left to personnel with appropriate experience and authority. This operation has been approved at the highest levels of Army Command. Captain Morrison intervened before the discussion could escalate further. Colonel, if Specialist Morrison has identified security concerns with your communication plan, those concerns need to be addressed before any operation proceeds. She has more experience with Pacific communication networks than anyone in this room. The meeting ended without resolution, but Ellie had learned an important lesson about the politics of military decision-making. Her technical expertise was valued, but it also made her a target for criticism when she disagreed with senior officers. She was walking a delicate line between professional competence and political survival. A few weeks later, news reached Norfolk Station that Colonel Bradley's unauthorized reconnaissance mission had proceeded using alternative communication methods. The mission had been detected by Japanese forces, resulting in the capture of 3 American operatives and the destruction of a resistance network that had been operating successfully for over a year. The communication vulnerabilities that Ellie had identified had indeed been exploited by enemy intelligence. The incident reinforced her reputation as someone whose technical judgment should be trusted, but it also made her aware that her growing influence was creating enemies as well as admirers. Some senior officers began to view her as an obstacle to operations they considered necessary, regardless of the risks involved. In October 1943, Ellie received new orders that surprised everyone at Norfolk Station. She was being transferred to a classified communication facility in Washington, D.C., to work directly with the Joint Chiefs of Staff on Pacific Theater communication planning. The transfer came with a promotion to Petty Officer First Class and assignment to a Special Projects Division that reported directly to Admiral Richardson. Her farewell gathering at Norfolk Station was attended by more people than she had expected. Even Commander Phillips, who had initially dismissed her concerns about the USS Hartley, offered genuine praise for her contributions to the station's communication capabilities. Morrison, you've taught us all something about the importance of listening carefully and trusting our technical training, he said during the informal ceremony. Norfolk Station is losing one of its most valuable assets. Lieutenant Commander Chin pulled her aside before she left for Washington. Ellie, you're moving into a much more complex environment where technical competence is just the beginning. You'll be dealing with strategic decisions that affect thousands of lives and major military operations. Remember that your value lies not just in your ability to operate communication equipment, but in your judgment about when and how to use it. As Ellie packed her belongings for the move to Washington, she reflected on how much her life had changed since that morning in July when she first detected the faint SOS signal from the USS Hartley. She had gone from being an overlooked communications specialist to someone whose opinions were sought by senior commanders planning major military operations. But she also understood that her greatest challenges lay ahead. Washington would bring new pressures, higher stakes, and more complex ethical dilemmas. Her reputation for exceptional communication work had opened doors she never expected to walk through, but it had also created expectations that would be increasingly difficult to meet. The train journey to Washington gave her time to think about the path that had brought her to this point. She had learned to trust her technical skills and professional judgment, even when others questioned her conclusions. She had discovered that doing the right thing often required taking personal risks that others might not understand or appreciate. Most importantly, she had proven to herself that gender and experience level were less important than competence and integrity. In a military organization that still struggled to accept women in technical roles, she had earned respect through performance rather than politics. As the train pulled into Washington's Union Station, Ellie felt both excitement and apprehension about the next phase of her career. She was about to join the highest levels of military communication planning, where her decisions would affect major strategic operations across the Pacific Theater. The quiet determination that had served her well at Norfolk Station would be tested in ways she couldn't yet imagine. But she was ready for the challenge. The young woman who had once been dismissed as just another pretty face filling a man's job had become Petty Officer Eleanor Morrison, one of the Navy's most trusted communication specialists. Her call sign, Whiskey Echo 7, was now recognized throughout the Atlantic Fleet Command structure, and her reputation for reliability and technical excellence was opening opportunities that few women in the 1940s military could have imagined. The next phase of her journey would take her to the heart of American military planning, where her voice would help coordinate operations involving hundreds of ships and thousands of personnel across the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. The Pentagon in 1943 was a maze of corridors, classified meeting rooms, and bustling activity that never seemed to pause, even during the late-night hours. Eleanor Morrison's new office was located in the basement level of the building, in a section that officially didn't exist on any public floor plans. The Special Communications Division operated around the clock, coordinating complex military operations across multiple theaters of war. Admiral Richardson himself had briefed her during her first week in Washington. The Admiral was a legendary figure in naval communications, having pioneered many of the encryption and frequency management techniques that were now standard throughout the fleet. His reputation for demanding perfection was matched only by his willingness to support personnel who demonstrated exceptional capability. Morrison, your work at Norfolk Station has been noted at the highest levels of command, Admiral Richardson had told her during their initial meeting. We're moving into a phase of Pacific operations that will require communication coordination unlike anything attempted in military history. The upcoming campaigns will involve simultaneous operations across thousands of miles of ocean, with timing that must be precise to the minute. Her new assignment involved developing communication protocols for Operation Galvanic, the planned assault on the Gilbert Islands that would mark the beginning of the American offensive drive across the Central Pacific. The operation would require coordination between Navy task forces, Marine assault units, Army Air Corps bomber squadrons, and Allied naval forces from Australia and New Zealand. Working alongside her in the Special Communications Division were some of the most experienced signal officers in the military. Commander James Wilson had designed the communication systems used in the successful North African campaigns. Lieutenant Colonel Maria Santos had coordinated communication for the Sicily invasion. Chief Petty Officer Robert Chong had managed submarine communication networks throughout the Pacific since the beginning of the war. Despite her youth and relatively limited experience, Ellie quickly established herself as an integral member of the team. Her ability to identify potential communication vulnerabilities and develop alternative protocols impressed her colleagues, who had initially been skeptical about working with someone so new to strategic planning. The first major test of her new role came in November 1943, during the final planning phase for Operation Galvanic. The invasion of Tarawa and Makin atolls required precise coordination between naval bombardment, air support, and amphibious assault forces. Any breakdown in communication could result in friendly fire casualties or leave Marine units without crucial support during the assault. Ellie was assigned to develop backup communication protocols for the operation. Her task was to create alternative communication channels that could maintain coordination if the primary communication networks failed or were disrupted by enemy action. This required her to understand not only the technical aspects of radio communication, but also the tactical requirements of each unit involved in the operation. She spent weeks studying the operational plans, learning about amphibious assault tactics, naval gunfire support procedures, and close air support coordination. She interviewed commanders from each service branch to understand their specific communication needs and potential failure points. The complexity of the task was unlike anything she had encountered during her previous assignments. Working 18-hour days, Ellie designed a multi-layered communication system that provided redundancy at every critical junction. Primary communication would use standard encrypted radio frequencies. If those failed, backup frequencies would automatically activate. If radio communication was completely disrupted, visual signaling and messenger boat systems would maintain basic coordination capability. But the real innovation in her design was the integration of submarine communication networks into the overall system. By positioning submarines at strategic locations around the invasion area, she created communication relay points that would be nearly impossible for Japanese forces to disrupt. The submarines could maintain contact with the main fleet while providing communication support for units operating close to enemy positions. When she presented her communication plan to the Joint Planning Committee, the reaction was initially skeptical. Several senior officers questioned whether such a complex system could be implemented reliably under combat conditions. Others worried that the innovative approaches she proposed had not been tested in actual operations. Admiral Richardson supported her plan, but he also made it clear that its success or failure would significantly impact her future career. "Morrison, you've designed what could be the most sophisticated military communication system ever attempted. If it works, you'll have contributed significantly to American success in the Pacific. If it fails, the consequences could be catastrophic." The pressure was immense, but Ellie had learned to trust her technical judgment and thorough preparation. She spent the weeks before the operation conducting communication tests with units training for the invasion. She worked directly with radio operators, submarine commanders, and tactical air coordinators to ensure everyone understood the protocol she had developed. On November 20th, 1943, Operation Galvanic began with the naval bombardment of Tarawa and Macon atolls. Ellie was stationed in the Pentagon Communications Center, monitoring the complex web of radio traffic that connected the invasion forces. For the first few hours, the operation proceeded according to plan, with communication flowing smoothly through her primary networks. But as Marine units began landing on the heavily defended beaches of Tarawa, Japanese resistance proved to be far more intense than anticipated. Artillery fire and mortar attacks disrupted several primary communication sites, exactly the kind of situation Ellie had prepared for in her backup protocols. When the communication center received reports that the Marines on Red Beach were cut off from artillery support coordination, Ellie immediately activated her submarine relay network. USS Nautilus, positioned offshore from Tarawa, became the communication hub for coordinating naval gunfire support with the isolated Marine units. The system worked flawlessly. Despite the loss of several primary communication sites, Marine commanders were able to maintain contact with supporting naval forces throughout the critical first day of fighting. Artillery support continued without interruption, and close air support missions were coordinated effectively even when ground-based communication equipment was destroyed by enemy fire. Over the 3 days of fighting at Tarawa, Ellie's communication system was tested repeatedly as combat conditions disrupted various elements of the network. Each time, the backup protocols activated smoothly, maintaining the coordination necessary for successful operations. When the Gilbert Islands were finally secured, Admiral Richardson called her into his office for a personal debriefing. "Morrison, your communication system performed better than anyone dared hope." Marine commanders specifically credited the reliable communication support with reducing casualties and accelerating the capture of their objectives. "You've demonstrated that innovative thinking combined with thorough preparation can solve problems that have challenged military planners for decades." The success of Operation Galvanic established Ellie's reputation as one of the military's most capable communication planners. But it also brought new challenges and responsibilities that tested her in ways she hadn't anticipated. Senior commanders began requesting her personal involvement in planning for increasingly complex operations across the Pacific Theater. In December 1943, she was assigned to the Planning Committee for Operation Flintlock, the planned invasion of the Marshall Islands. This operation would be even more complex than galvanic, involving simultaneous assaults on multiple island targets and requiring coordination with British and Australian naval forces operating in different time zones. But the Marshall Islands planning also introduced her to the political complexities of Allied cooperation. British and Australian communication protocols were different from American systems, and integrating them into a unified network required diplomatic as well as technical skills. She found herself attending meetings where strategic decisions were influenced as much by national pride and inter-service rivalry as by military necessity. During one particularly tense planning session, British Admiral Cunningham questioned whether American communication systems were sophisticated enough to handle coordination with Royal Navy operations. His comments implied that British naval communication was superior to anything the Americans had developed. Ellie's response was measured but firm. "Admiral Cunningham, our communication systems have been tested under combat conditions in multiple theaters. The protocols we're proposing for Marshall Islands operations incorporate the best features of American, British, and Australian systems. If you have specific technical concerns about integration procedures, I'd be happy to address them in detail." The exchange established her credibility with Allied commanders, but it also demonstrated that her role now extended far beyond technical communication planning. She was representing American military capability in international forums where national reputations were at stake. The complexity of her new responsibilities became even more apparent when she was briefed on Ultra, the top-secret program that had broken Japanese naval communication codes. The intelligence gathered through Ultra provided crucial information about Japanese defensive preparations and ship movements, but it also created enormous security challenges for American communication planning. Any American communication that revealed knowledge gained through Ultra could potentially alert Japanese forces that their codes had been compromised. Ellie had to design communication protocols that allowed American forces to act on Ultra intelligence without revealing the source of their information. This required layers of deception and misdirection that made even routine communication extremely complex. Working with cryptanalysts from the Army Signal Corps and Navy communication security personnel, she developed protocols that masked the true source of tactical intelligence while ensuring that American commanders received the information they needed for successful operations. The system required careful coordination between multiple intelligence agencies and communication networks, creating new vulnerabilities that had to be constantly monitored and protected. The stress of working with such sensitive information began to affect her personal life in ways she hadn't expected. She couldn't discuss her work with friends or family, and the constant pressure of knowing that communication failures could compromise crucial intelligence sources or result in American casualties made it difficult for her to relax even during off-duty hours. In January 1944, she received a personal letter from Lieutenant Commander Chun at Norfolk Station. Chun had been promoted and was being transferred to the Pacific Theater to oversee communication operations for Admiral Nimitz's Central Pacific campaign. The letter included an invitation for Ellie to request transfer to Chin's new command, which would mean leaving Washington and joining the operational headquarters planning the advance toward Japan. The decision was difficult. Her work in Washington had established her as one of the military's leading communication specialists, and Admiral Richardson had hinted that even greater responsibilities might be available if she remained in the capital. But the opportunity to work directly with operational commanders in the Pacific Theater was exactly the kind of challenge she had been hoping for. After discussing the options with Admiral Richardson, she decided to accept Chin's invitation. The Admiral was disappointed, but supportive. Morrison you've contributed more to strategic communication planning than anyone could have expected. But I understand the appeal of operational assignment. The Pacific Theater will give you opportunities to test your innovations under real combat conditions. Her farewell from the Pentagon was attended by colleagues from throughout the military communication community. The respect she had earned was evident in the personal notes and recommendations she received from senior officers who had initially been skeptical about her capabilities. Commander Wilson, who had been her most demanding critic during the galvanic planning, offered perhaps the highest praise she received. Morrison, you've proven that technical excellence combined with strategic thinking can revolutionize military communication. The systems you've developed will influence how we coordinate operations for years to come. As she prepared for transfer to the Pacific Theater, Ellie reflected on how much her understanding of military communication had expanded since her assignment to Washington. She had learned that successful communication planning required not only technical expertise, but also diplomatic skills, strategic thinking, and the ability to work effectively under enormous pressure. Most importantly, she had proven to herself and others that innovative approaches to complex problems could achieve results that traditional methods could not match. Her willingness to challenge established procedures and propose new solutions had earned her recognition at the highest levels of military command. The next phase of her career would take her to the operational headquarters where the final campaigns against Japan were being planned and executed. There, her communication systems would be tested under the most demanding conditions imaginable, coordinating operations involving millions of personnel across the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. The humid air of Guam hit Eleanor Morrison like a wall as she stepped off the transport aircraft in March 1944. Admiral Nimitz's Pacific Fleet headquarters had been established on the island following its recapture from Japanese forces, and the facility buzzed with activity as staff officers planned the next phase of operations against the Japanese home islands. The contrast between the Pentagon's sterile corridors and this operational command center was immediately apparent. Lieutenant Commander Chun greeted her at the airfield with a warm smile and a crisp salute. "Welcome to the real war, Morrison. I hope you're ready for a completely different kind of challenge." The drive to the headquarters compound gave Ellie her first glimpse of the massive scale of operations being coordinated from Guam. Ships filled the harbor as far as she could see, aircraft crowded the runways, and supply depots stretched for miles along the coastline. Her new office was located in a Quonset hut that housed the Joint Communication Planning section. Unlike the sophisticated facilities she had grown accustomed to in Washington, this was a functional workspace designed for rapid decision-making under combat conditions. Banks of radio equipment lined the walls, situation maps covered every available surface, and teletype machines chattered constantly with updates from across the Pacific Theater. The staff she would be working with represented the most experienced operational planners in the Pacific. Captain Robert Heinlein had coordinated communication for every major amphibious operation since Guadalcanal. Commander Patricia Williams had designed the submarine communication networks that were proving crucial to the success of unrestricted submarine warfare against Japanese shipping. Chief Petty Officer David Kim had managed tactical air communication for the carrier battles that had devastated the Japanese Navy. Admiral Nimitz himself briefed the communication planning team during Ellie's first week at Guam. The Admiral's reputation for quiet competence and strategic brilliance was legendary throughout the Navy, and his personal involvement in communication planning reflected the critical importance of reliable coordination for upcoming operations. The next phase of our campaign will require communication coordination on a scale never before attempted in military history, Admiral Nimitz explained during the briefing. Operation Forager will involve simultaneous assaults on Saipan, Guam, and Tinian, with supporting operations throughout the Mariana Islands. We must coordinate the movements of over 500 ships, 1,000 aircraft, and 200,000 personnel across 500 miles of ocean. The complexity of the task was staggering. Each island assault would require independent communication networks capable of coordinating naval gunfire support, close air support, and amphibious operations. But these individual networks also had to be integrated into an overall system that could shift resources between different objectives as tactical situations developed. Ellie was assigned to lead the development of inter-island communication protocols that would allow commanders to coordinate operations across the entire Mariana Islands chain. This meant creating communication links that could function reliably over distances of hundreds of miles while maintaining security against Japanese interception efforts. Working with the latest intelligence reports about Japanese defensive preparations, she discovered that enemy forces had been studying American communication procedures from previous operations. Japanese intelligence had identified patterns in American radio traffic that revealed operational intentions, and they were using this knowledge to anticipate and counter American tactical moves. This intelligence led Ellie to propose a revolutionary approach to operational communication security. Instead of simply encrypting radio transmissions, she suggested implementing a system of deceptive communication that would actively mislead Japanese intelligence about American intentions while providing accurate information to authorized personnel. The deception system she designed involved multiple layers of authentic sounding, but false radio traffic mixed with genuine operational communications. Japanese monitoring stations would receive realistic-sounding discussions of operations that were not actually being planned, while real operations were coordinated through alternative channels that appeared to be routine administrative traffic. Implementing this system required coordination with intelligence specialists who understood Japanese monitoring capabilities and operational planners who could create convincing false scenarios. Ellie found herself working directly with commanders from Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet and General MacArthur's Southwest Pacific Forces to ensure the deception plan supported overall strategic objectives. The testing phase for the new communication protocols took place during preliminary operations in the Marshall Islands. American forces conducted several small-scale raids designed to test both the effectiveness of the communication system and the success of the deception measures. The results exceeded all expectations. Japanese forces consistently responded to the false operational information contained in the deceptive radio traffic, moving defensive resources to counter operations that were never actually planned. Meanwhile, real American operations benefited from reduced enemy resistance because Japanese commanders had been misled about American intentions and capabilities. When Admiral Nimitz reviewed the test results, his response was characteristically understated but clearly pleased. "Morrison, you've given us a significant advantage that extends far beyond communication efficiency. The Japanese are now fighting against operations that exist only in their imagination, while we coordinate our real attacks without interference." But success also brought new pressures and responsibilities that tested Ellie's leadership abilities in unexpected ways. As word of her innovative communication systems spread throughout the Pacific Command structure, she began receiving requests for support that went far beyond her assigned duties. Submarine commanders wanted her to design special communication protocols for deep reconnaissance missions. Air Force planners sought her advice on coordinating long-range bombing operations. Intelligence officers requested her assistance with communication security for sensitive information gathering operations. Each additional responsibility brought new challenges and potential conflicts with her primary assignment. When Admiral King, the Chief of Naval Operations, personally requested her involvement in planning communication support for a potential invasion of the Japanese home islands, she had to carefully balance multiple competing demands on her time and expertise. The situation became even more complex when she was approached by representatives from the Manhattan Project. The top-secret atomic weapons program required communication support for testing operations and potential military deployment, but the security requirements were unlike anything she had previously encountered. The very existence of the program was classified at levels that prevented normal coordination with other military communication networks. Working on Manhattan Project communication requirements meant operating in complete isolation from her regular duties. She had to develop communication protocols without being able to discuss her work with colleagues who might normally provide technical advice or operational input. The psychological strain of maintaining such strict secrecy while handling responsibilities that could affect the outcome of the war was enormous. During this period, Ellie also faced personal challenges that threatened her professional effectiveness. The constant pressure of working with classified information and the isolation required by security protocols had strained her relationships with colleagues and friends. She was working 18-hour days regularly, and this stress was beginning to affect her health and judgment. The crisis came in May 1944, during the final preparation phase for Operation Forger. While testing communication protocols for the Saipan assault, she discovered a critical vulnerability in the system that could potentially compromise the entire operation. Enemy forces could exploit timing patterns in the communication traffic to determine exactly when and where American assaults would begin. Fixing the vulnerability required completely redesigning major portions of the communication plan just weeks before the operation was scheduled to begin. This meant working with hundreds of radio operators, ship commanders, and tactical coordinators to implement new procedures under enormous time pressure. For 72 consecutive hours, Ellie worked without meaningful rest to coordinate the massive effort required to implement the communication system changes. She functioned on coffee, determination, and the knowledge that any failure could result in thousands of American casualties during the Saipan landings. The effort nearly broke her physically. On the third night of continuous work, she collapsed at her desk from exhaustion and had to be taken to the base medical facility. The doctor who examined her was blunt about the consequences of continuing to work at such an intense pace. "Morrison, your body is showing signs of severe stress and exhaustion. If you continue pushing yourself at this rate, you're going to have a complete physical breakdown that could end your career and potentially damage your health permanently." But there was no time for rest. The Saipan landings were scheduled to begin in less than 2 weeks, and the communication system modifications were still incomplete. Against medical advice, Ellie returned to duty after only 6 hours of rest, determined to ensure the operation had the communication support necessary for success. Lieutenant Commander Chun confronted her about the situation with characteristic directness. "Ellie, you're trying to handle responsibilities that should be distributed among a dozen officers. You've become so focused on perfection that you're not delegating tasks that others are perfectly capable of handling." Chin's intervention forced Ellie to acknowledge that her approach to leadership needed to change. She had been so concerned about maintaining the technical excellence of her communication systems that she had failed to develop the management skills necessary for coordinating large-scale operations. Success at her new level of responsibility required learning to trust others and effectively distribute complex tasks among team members. With Chin's guidance, she reorganized her approach to the communication system modifications. Instead of trying to personally oversee every technical detail, she assigned specific responsibilities to qualified team members and focused her own efforts on overall coordination and quality control. The change in approach proved to be more effective than her previous methods, and the modifications were completed on schedule. On June 15, 1944, Operation Forger began with the landings on Saipan. The communication system that Ellie had designed and implemented performed flawlessly throughout the complex operation. Coordination between naval forces, air support, and ground troops was maintained even during the heaviest fighting, and the deception measures successfully misled Japanese commanders about American tactical intentions. The success of the Saipan landings led directly to the capture of Guam and Tinian, giving American forces control of the Central Pacific and providing bases from which long-range bombing operations against Japan could be conducted. The communication systems that enabled this success had been tested under the most demanding combat conditions imaginable. Admiral Nimitz personally commended the communication planning team for their contribution to the operation's success. But for Ellie, the most meaningful recognition came from the radio operators and tactical coordinators who had used her systems under combat conditions. Their feedback confirmed that innovative technical solutions could be successfully implemented by personnel operating under extreme pressure. However, the success of Operation Forger also brought new challenges that would test everything she had learned about leadership, technical innovation, and strategic planning. American forces were now positioned to begin the final advance toward Japan itself, and the communication requirements for those operations would exceed anything previously attempted in military history. As she prepared for the next phase of operations, Ellie reflected on how much she had changed since her arrival at Guam. She had learned to balance technical perfectionism with practical leadership requirements. She had discovered that successful innovation required not only creative solutions, but also the ability to implement those solutions through large, complex organizations operating under combat conditions. Most importantly, she had proven that the communication system she designed could perform reliably when the stakes were highest. Her call sign, Whiskey Echo 7, was now known throughout the Pacific Fleet as synonymous with reliable, innovative communication support. The quiet determination that had driven her to investigate that faint SOS signal from the USS Hartley had evolved into the strategic leadership skills necessary for coordinating operations involving hundreds of thousands of personnel. But her greatest test still lay ahead. The final operations against Japan would require communication coordination on a scale that had never been attempted, and the success or failure of those operations would determine the outcome of the entire Pacific War. August 1945 found Eleanor Morrison standing in the communication center aboard the USS Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Bay as part of the massive Allied fleet assembled for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan. But the atmosphere aboard the flagship was tense with uncertainty rather than the focused determination that had characterized previous major operations. Recent developments had created possibilities that no one had anticipated when the invasion plans were first developed. The successful testing of atomic weapons had introduced an entirely new dimension to strategic planning. President Truman's decision to authorize their use against Japanese cities was being implemented through communication channels that Ellie had helped design and secure. The responsibility of coordinating communications for operations that could potentially end the war weighed heavily on everyone involved in the planning process. Admiral Halsey, commanding the Third Fleet, had requested her personal involvement in coordinating the complex communication requirements for what everyone hoped would be the final operations of the war. The challenge was unlike anything she had previously encountered because the strategic situation was changing daily as American leaders evaluated Japanese responses to the atomic attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Morrison, we need communication protocols that can coordinate everything from a full-scale invasion to an immediate ceasefire, Admiral Halsey explained during a briefing aboard the Missouri. The Japanese government appears to be considering surrender, but we must be prepared for any eventuality. If they choose to fight, Operation Downfall will be the largest amphibious operation in military history. If they surrender, we need to coordinate an immediate transition to occupation duties. The communication challenge was staggering in its complexity. Operation Downfall involved over 1 million American personnel, thousands of ships, and aircraft from bases across the Pacific. But the possibility of sudden surrender meant that all of these forces might need to transition instantly from combat operations to occupation and peacekeeping duties. Ellie worked with a team of senior communication specialists to develop protocols that could handle both scenarios simultaneously. The system had to provide secure communication for combat operations while also maintaining channels for diplomatic communication with Japanese officials who might be negotiating surrender terms. On August 15, 1945, at 1,200 hours local time, the communication center aboard the Missouri received the message that changed everything. Emperor Hirohito's surrender announcement had been broadcast throughout Japan, and Japanese officials were requesting communication with Allied authorities to begin formal surrender negotiations. The moment that every communication planner had prepared for had arrived, but the reality was far more complex than anyone had anticipated. Instead of coordinating massive military operations, Ellie found herself managing communication links between American commanders, Japanese officials, allied diplomatic representatives, and government leaders in Washington, all while maintaining security protocols that prevented unauthorized personnel from accessing sensitive negotiations. Admiral MacArthur, who had been designated as Supreme Commander for the Allied powers in Japan, established his headquarters aboard the Missouri to oversee the surrender process. The communication requirements for coordinating with Japanese officials while maintaining security and preventing any possibility of deception or treachery required constant innovation and adaptation. Ellie was assigned to manage the technical aspects of communication security for the surrender negotiations. This meant ensuring that all communication between Allied and Japanese officials was accurately transmitted and received while preventing any possibility that Japanese officials might use the communication channels for intelligence gathering or deceptive purposes. The work required her to coordinate with intelligence specialists who understood Japanese communication capabilities, diplomatic personnel who were managing the political aspects of the surrender negotiations, and military commanders who remained responsible for maintaining readiness in case the negotiations failed. For 2 weeks, she worked around the clock to maintain reliable communication links as the details of Japanese surrender were negotiated and implemented. The technical challenges were complicated by the fact that Japanese communication equipment used different standards from American systems, requiring constant adaptation and translation of both technical protocols and message content. On September 2nd, 1945, the formal surrender ceremony took place aboard the USS Missouri. Ellie was stationed in the communications center, managing the radio and teletype links that carried news of the ceremony to Allied commands throughout the Pacific and to government leaders around the world. As she listened to the radio transmissions describing the signing of the surrender documents, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. For years earlier, she had been an overlooked communications specialist whose concerns were dismissed by her superiors. Now, she was coordinating communication for the event that marked the end of the largest war in human history. The ceremony itself was broadcast live to radio stations around the world, and Ellie was responsible for ensuring that the technical quality of those transmissions met the historic importance of the moment. The pressure was enormous because technical failures could have disrupted coverage of one of the most significant events of the 20th century. When General MacArthur's voice came through the communication system announcing the formal end of hostilities, Ellie felt a combination of professional pride and emotional exhaustion that reflected the intensity of her wartime service. The communication systems she had designed and implemented had performed their role in ending the war, but the personal cost had been higher than she had anticipated when she first detected that faint SOS signal from the USS Hartley. Following the surrender ceremony, Ellie was assigned to the communication planning team for the Allied occupation of Japan. The task of coordinating communication for an occupying force of several 100,000 personnel spread across the Japanese home islands required different approaches from wartime operations, but the complexity was equally demanding. Instead of coordinating combat operations, she now had to design communication networks that could support the civil administration of a defeated nation while maintaining security against potential resistance or sabotage. The work required understanding not only technical communication requirements, but also the political and cultural challenges of military occupation. During the occupation planning process, she worked closely with Japanese communication engineers who had been assigned to assist with the integration of Japanese communication infrastructure into Allied networks. These interactions gave her insight into the technical capabilities and innovations that Japanese forces had developed during the war. To her surprise, she discovered that Japanese communication specialists had developed several technical innovations that exceeded American capabilities in specific areas. Their experience with long-range communication across the vast Pacific had led to advances in antenna design and signal processing that could benefit American communication systems. This realization led to one of her most significant contributions to post-war communication development. She proposed a technical exchange program that would allow American and Japanese communication specialists to share innovations and develop improved systems that incorporated the best features of both approaches. The proposal was controversial because it required treating former enemy personnel as technical colleagues rather than defeated adversaries. Several senior officers argued that sharing American communication technology with Japanese engineers could compromise security and potentially provide assistance to future enemies. But Admiral Nimitz supported her proposal, recognizing that technical cooperation could accelerate the development of communication systems that would be crucial for post-war military operations and international cooperation. The program she designed became a model for technical cooperation between former enemies and contributed to communication advances that benefited both American and Japanese forces. In November 1945, 6 months after the end of the war, Ellie received orders for her next assignment that surprised everyone who knew her military career. Instead of continuing with operational communication duties, she was being transferred to the Naval Academy in Annapolis to establish the first comprehensive communication technology curriculum for future naval officers. The assignment reflected recognition that the war had demonstrated the crucial importance of communication technology for military success, and that future officers needed more sophisticated training than had been available before the war. She would be responsible for developing courses that would prepare the next generation of naval leaders to understand and effectively use communication technology. The transfer also represented a fundamental change in how the Navy viewed the role of communication specialists. Instead of being considered support personnel who simply operated equipment designed by others, they were now recognized as technical leaders whose expertise was crucial for strategic planning and operational success. During her final weeks at the Pacific Fleet headquarters, Ellie received recognition that exceeded anything she had expected when she began her military service. Admiral Nimitz personally presented her with the Distinguished Service Medal, one of the highest decorations available to non-combat personnel. Morrison, your innovations in military communication have contributed significantly to our success in the Pacific Theater, Admiral Nimitz said during the presentation ceremony. More importantly, you have demonstrated that technical excellence combined with strategic thinking can revolutionize how military operations are planned and executed. The medal citation specifically mentioned her role in developing communication systems for Operations Galvanic, Forager, and Downfall, as well as her contributions to communication security and deception operations throughout the Pacific Campaign. But for Ellie, the most meaningful recognition came from the many officers and enlisted personnel who approached her after the ceremony to express their appreciation for communication systems that had supported them during combat operations. Lieutenant Commander Chun, who had become both her supervisor and mentor, offered perhaps the most perceptive assessment of her contributions during a private conversation following the medal ceremony. Ellie, what you've accomplished goes beyond technical innovation. You've proven that military effectiveness depends on recognizing and developing talent regardless of traditional expectations about gender, experience, or background. The young women who will follow you into military service will benefit from the precedent you've established. As Ellie prepared for her transfer to Annapolis, she reflected on how much military communication had evolved during her 4 years of service. The technologies and techniques that had seemed revolutionary when she first detected the SOS from the USS Hartley were now standard throughout the fleet. More importantly, the military had learned to value technical innovation and to support personnel who could contribute to operational effectiveness regardless of their background or demographic characteristics. Her call sign, Whiskey Echo 7, had become legendary throughout the Pacific Fleet. Radio operators and communication specialists throughout the Navy knew it as a symbol of technical excellence and innovative thinking. But for Ellie, it represented something more personal, proof that determination and competence could overcome the barriers that others might try to impose. The train journey from San Francisco to Washington where she would complete her separation processing before reporting to Annapolis, gave her time to think about her post-war career. The Navy was offering her opportunities for advanced education and career development that would have been unimaginable for women just a few years earlier. But she had also received offers from civilian companies that were developing communication technologies for commercial use. The innovations that had proved crucial for military operations during the war were now being adapted for television broadcasting, long-distance telephone service, and other civilian applications. Whatever path she chose, Ellie knew that her military service had prepared her for challenges and opportunities that extended far beyond communication technology. She had learned to lead complex technical projects, to work effectively with personnel from different backgrounds and organizations, and to make critical decisions under pressure. Most importantly, she had proven to herself that individual determination and technical competence could make a difference in situations that affected thousands of lives. The quiet young woman who had once been dismissed as just another pretty face filling a man's job had become a recognized leader whose innovations had contributed to victory in the largest war in human history. 40 years later, when Admiral Richardson would hear her call sign crackling through static during a training exercise and remember the extraordinary woman who had revolutionized military communication, Ellie would be Professor Eleanor Morrison, Director of Communication Technology of the Naval Academy, still inspiring young officers to push beyond traditional boundaries and achieve excellence that others thought impossible. The story that began with an overlooked SOS signal had become a legend of determination, innovation, and the power of recognizing talent wherever it might be found.